Prologue. The Last Human Breath. My name is Clara Valen, and I died on a Tuesday night in October. Not metaphorically, not dramatically. I actually died. My heart stopped beating. My lungs ceased drawing breath. The electrical signals in my brain began to fade into nothingness. For approximately 4 minutes and 37 seconds, I was clinically dead, lying in a pool of my own blood on a dark street corner while the city continued its indifferent rhythm around me. The car that killed me was going at least 70 miles per hour through a residential neighborhood. Some drunk driver racing home after the bars closed, not caring about traffic lights or speed limits, or the 28-year-old medical resident who happened to be walking home from a late shift at the hospital. I never saw it coming. One moment I was thinking about the patient I had just intubated, mentally reviewing the procedure and wondering if I should have done anything differently. The next moment there was a screech of tires, a flash of blinding headlights that turned night into a terrible mockery of day, and then impact. I remember the feeling of being airborne. It's strange, the details that stick with you when you're dying. I remember thinking that I was flying, weightless, free. Then gravity reasserted itself and I came crashing down onto the pavement with a sound I can still hear in my darkest moments, a wet, terrible crack that echoed through my skull and told me that something fundamental had broken. The pain came next, not all at once, but in waves, each one worse than the last. I tried to move and discovered that my body wouldn't respond. The connection between my brain and my limbs had been severed, leaving me paralyzed and helpless. I tried to scream and found that I couldn't draw breath. Something was wrong with my lungs, something punctured and collapsed and failing. Blood filled my mouth. The taste of it was copper and iron and fear. I was drowning in my own blood, choking on it, feeling it bubble up from somewhere deep inside my chest where it was never supposed to be. My medical training kicked in automatically, cataloging my injuries with detached precision. Internal bleeding, probably from a ruptured spleen, possible punctured lung given the difficulty breathing, skull fracture judging from the way everything felt wrong and distant. Multiple broken ribs, severe trauma to the spine. I knew I was dying. That clinical voice in my head calculated my chances of survival, negligible without immediate surgical intervention, and even then the odds were poor. I had maybe 10 minutes before blood loss would cause irreversible organ damage, maybe less. The street was empty. No one had witnessed the accident. The driver had fled the scene. I heard tires squealing as he sped away, leaving me bleeding out on the pavement like discarded trash. No one was coming to help me. No ambulance would arrive in time. I was going to die alone on a cold October night, and no one would even know until my body was discovered hours later. I thought about my parents. They were going to get a phone call in the middle of the night, the kind of call every parent dreads. Their only daughter, killed in a hit-and-run accident. I thought about how it would destroy them, how they would never be the same. I thought about my best friend Sarah, who was supposed to meet me for coffee tomorrow morning. I thought about the patients I would never help, the lives I would never save, the career I had worked so hard for that was ending before it had really begun. I was 28 years old. I had just finished my 3rd year of residency. I had plans, dreams, a future that stretched out before me full of possibility. And it was all ending on some random Tuesday because a drunk driver couldn't be bothered to call a cab. The unfairness of it struck me harder than the car had. All those years of medical school, the sleepless nights, the crushing debt, the sacrifices I had made to pursue this calling. All the patients I had helped during my residency, the lives I had saved. I had dedicated my existence to healing others, to making the world a little better, a little less painful, and I couldn't even save myself. My vision was darkening at the edges, narrowing to a tunnel that grew smaller with each faltering heartbeat. The cold was spreading through my body, starting at my extremities and working its way inward toward my core. This was it. The end. In a few more seconds, I would lose consciousness, and shortly after that, my brain would shut down permanently. Clara Valen would cease to exist. But then something changed. Through the haze of pain and dying, I became aware of a presence. Someone was there, kneeling beside me in the growing pool of my blood. For a moment I thought it was a paramedic, that somehow help had arrived after all. But as my fading vision focused on the figure, I realized this was no paramedic. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost inhuman. Dark hair that fell across his forehead in perfect waves, despite the chaos of the moment. A face that looked like it had been carved from marble by a master sculptor, all sharp angles and aristocratic features that belonged in a Renaissance painting. And his eyes. God, his eyes. They glowed amber in the streetlight, catching and reflecting the light in a way that human eyes simply don't. He wore an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, completely out of place, kneeling in a pool of blood on a dirty street corner. His clothes should have been ruined, but somehow they remained pristine, as if the blood that was everywhere else simply refused to touch him. His cool hand touched my cheek, and I felt a jolt of sensation cut through the numbness that had been spreading through my body. It was like an electric shock, sudden and vivid and impossible to ignore. His touch was cold, colder than the October night, colder than the pavement beneath me, but somehow comforting. He looked at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. Not with pity, I had seen enough pity in my work at the hospital to recognize it, but with something else. Something that looked like recognition, like he was seeing something in me that even I didn't know was there. His gaze was assessing, calculating, making some kind of decision that I couldn't understand. I tried to speak, tried to ask for help, tried to beg him to call an ambulance, but blood filled my mouth when I opened it, spilling over my lips and down my chin. I was drowning in it, choking on my own mortality. My vision was fading completely now, the world reducing to just his face, those strange glowing eyes, and the terrible certainty that these were the last things I would ever see. And then he spoke. His voice was low, calm, impossibly composed for someone kneeling beside a dying woman. It had a musical quality to it, an accent I couldn't quite place that suggested he was from somewhere else, some other time. He spoke my name, Clara, and that made me wonder how he knew it. Had he found my hospital ID? Was he reading it somehow? He told me I was dying, as if I didn't already know, as if the blood filling my lungs and the cold spreading through my veins weren't making that abundantly clear. But the way he said it was different, not sympathetic or regretful, but simply factual. A statement of reality. He told me there was no ambulance that would arrive in time, no surgeon skilled enough to repair the damage that had been done to my body, no miracle of modern medicine that could undo what the drunk driver had wrought. He spoke with absolute certainty, and somehow I knew he was telling the truth. But then, and this is where my dying brain started to suspect I was hallucinating, he told me there was another option, that he could offer me something else, a different kind of life, a choice that came with an impossible price. He told me he was a vampire. I should have dismissed it as insanity, should have thought he was a madman who happened to stumble across my dying body, should have assumed that my oxygen-starved brain was conjuring hallucinations as it shut down. But something in his eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine, told me he was telling the truth. He explained it quickly, efficiently, as if he could sense that my time was running out. He could save me, he said, but I wouldn't be human anymore. I would become what he was, a creature of the night, immortal and powerful and forever changed. I would have to leave behind everything I knew, everyone I loved. My human life would end completely, and what came after would be darker than anything I had experienced. He told me about the hunger, the constant, gnawing need for blood that would define my existence. He told me about the isolation, the impossibility of maintaining human relationships when you were no longer human. He told me about the weight of immortality, about watching everyone you care about grow old and die while you remained forever young. He painted a picture of eternal life that was more curse than blessing, but he also told me I would survive, that I would be strong, powerful, capable of things I couldn't imagine, that I would have time, endless time to learn and grow and make a difference in the world. That death didn't have to be the end. He gave me a choice: die here, tonight, as Clara Valen the human, let my parents bury me, let my friends mourn me, let my potential go unfulfilled. Or accept his offer and live forever as something else, something that fed on blood and hid from sunlight and existed in the shadows of human civilization. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that vampires weren't real, that I was hallucinating in my final moments. But the dying part of me, the part that could feel life slipping away with each weakening heartbeat, the part that wasn't ready to end, the part that still had so much left to do, didn't care about rationality. I wanted to live. However impossible the terms, whatever the cost, I wanted to survive. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords were paralyzed, my lungs too damaged to draw breath, so I did the only thing I could do. I looked at him with what remained of my consciousness and managed the smallest nod. Barely a movement, just the slightest tilt of my head. But it was enough. He understood. Something flickered in those amber eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or determination, or something else I couldn't name. He lifted his wrist to his mouth, and I saw his teeth normal human teeth one moment, and then suddenly elongating into fangs that were very definitely not human. They looked sharp enough to cut through steel. He bit his own wrist, and dark blood welled up from the wound. Not the bright red of arterial bleeding, but something darker, thicker, wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. He pressed the wound to my lips, and his blood flowed into my mouth. That single gesture sealed my fate. Part 1. The transformation. What happened next is seared into my memory with a clarity I wish I could forget. Some experiences are too intense, too overwhelming to ever fade, and transformation from human to vampire is definitely one of them. Lucian's blood hit my tongue, and I tasted something unlike anything I had experienced as a human. It was thicker than blood should be, almost syrupy, and it tasted like copper and honey and electricity all mixed together. But more than the physical sensation, there was something else, an energy, a power, a vital force that I could feel even through my dying haze. For a moment, nothing happened. I swallowed the blood reflexively, felt it slide down my throat, and wondered if this had all been some elaborate hallucination after all. Maybe I was already dead and this was just my brain firing randomly in its final moments, creating a bizarre narrative to make sense of dying. Then the pain began. I have been through a lot in my medical training. I've witnessed patients in agony from conditions that would make most people faint just hearing about them. I've seen pain in all its forms, acute and chronic, physical and psychological, bearable and absolutely not. I thought I understood suffering. I thought I had seen the worst that the human body could experience. I was wrong. The transformation started in my chest, right at my core, and spread outward like wildfire. It felt like I was being torn apart from the inside out, like every cell in my body was simultaneously dying and being reborn. My blood, what was left of it, turned to fire in my veins. My bones felt like they were breaking and reforming, resetting themselves with agonizing precision. My muscles spasmed and seized, contracting so hard I thought they might tear themselves apart. My heart, which had been stuttering weakly toward its final beats, suddenly stopped completely. Just stopped. For several seconds that felt like an eternity. There was nothing, no heartbeat, no pulse, no blood flow. I was dead. Truly, completely dead. And then my heart started beating again. But it was different. Each beat was slower, stronger, more deliberate. It felt like a war drum echoing through my entire being, announcing that something new had been born. The rhythm was wrong, too slow to be human, too powerful to be natural. Each pulse sent waves of sensation through my changing body, and with each wave, I felt more of my humanity slipping away. The pain continued, relentless and all-consuming. My senses were changing, expanding, becoming something more than human. I could feel every nerve ending in my body firing simultaneously. I could hear sounds that shouldn't have been audible, the rustling of fabric on Lucian's suit, the distant hum of electricity and power lines, the beating hearts of people blocks away. I could smell everything, blood and exhaust fumes and the subtle scent of decay that permeates city streets. My dying vision sharpened and expanded. The darkness that had been closing in was pushed back, replaced by a clarity that was almost painful. I could see individual dust motes floating in the air, could make out details in the shadows that should have been invisible, could perceive colors and contrasts that my human eyes had never been able to distinguish. Through it all, Lucian stayed with me. He had lifted me from the street, I don't remember that part. The pain was too consuming and we were moving. The world blurred around us as we traveled at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. Buildings became ribbons of light. Street lamps turned into streaks of gold. The night air rushed past so quickly it felt like drowning in wind. But I barely registered any of it. All I could focus on was the pain, the change, the fundamental reshaping of everything I was into something new. It felt like it went on forever, like I was trapped in an eternal moment of transformation that would never end. We arrived somewhere his home, I later learned, and he laid me on something soft, a bed probably, though it felt like clouds beneath my changing body. I stared up at a ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to move and breathe in the candlelight, and I thought about how strange it was that this might be the first thing I saw with my new eyes. The transformation took hours. I learned later that Lucien could have done it more gently, could have spread the change out over days or even weeks. But I was dying too fast. My human body was too damaged to survive even a few more minutes. He had to flood my system with his blood, forcing my body to change or die completely. It was the difference between renovation and demolition, followed by rapid reconstruction. During those hours, I drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite consciousness, but wasn't quite sleep either. A strange twilight state where I was aware of the pain and the change, but disconnected from it, as if it was happening to someone else. Lucien stayed with me the entire time, his cool hand on my forehead, his voice murmuring words I couldn't understand but found strangely comforting. He wiped blood-red tears from my eyes. I was crying blood, actually crying blood, which should have been horrifying but somehow just felt right. He told me I was strong, that I was surviving, that I was becoming something extraordinary. His voice was an anchor in the chaos, something to hold on to while my entire existence was being rewritten. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into a few hours, the pain began to subside. Not disappear, it would take days for the last echoes of transformation to fully fade, but diminish to something manageable. The fire in my veins cooled to a steady warmth. My muscles stopped their violent spasming. My senses, while still overwhelming, began to feel less like an assault and more like enhanced perception. I opened my eyes, really opened them, not the half-conscious fluttering I had been managing during the transformation. And the world had changed, awakening to a new reality. My first thought upon truly waking as a vampire was that the world had somehow become more real, more vivid, more detailed. As if I had been looking at life through a dirty window my entire human existence, and someone had finally cleaned the glass. I could see everything with a clarity that bordered on overwhelming. The ceiling above me was painted with constellations, not just simple stars, but detailed astronomical charts that included nebulae and galaxies, and celestial phenomena I recognized from my college astronomy class. I could see every brushstroke the artist had used, could count the individual stars if I wanted to, could perceive depth and dimension in what should have been a flat painting. The room around me was filled with details I would have missed as a human. Dust motes floating in streams of candlelight, each one visible and distinct. The grain of wood in the furniture, the texture of fabric in the curtains, the microscopic imperfections in what had seemed like perfectly smooth walls. It was like looking at the world through a microscope, seeing layers of reality that had been invisible before. But vision was just the beginning. My hearing had expanded to encompass sounds I didn't know existed. I could hear Lucien moving somewhere else in the building, not just his footsteps, but his breathing, the rustle of his clothes, even the slow, steady beat of his heart. I could hear pipes in the walls carrying water, electricity humming through wires, the building itself settling and creaking as temperature changes caused minute expansions and contractions. Beyond the building, I could hear the city. People talking in nearby apartments, their words clear even through walls and distance. Cars driving on streets blocks away, engines and tires creating a symphony of urban sound. Mice scurrying through alleys, cats hunting, dogs barking, the entire ecosystem of nighttime city life laid out in auditory detail. And the hearts. God, the hearts. Every human within several blocks had a heartbeat I could hear, could track, could follow if I chose to. Each one was slightly different rhythms, different strengths, different patterns. It was like being able to hear everyone's life force, their vital energy broadcasting its presence to predators like me. My sense of smell had undergone a similar transformation. I could smell everything: the musty scent of old wood, the chemical odor of candle wax, the subtle aroma of dust and age that permeated the building. I could smell Lucian's distinctive scent, something like old books and expensive cologne and something else that was uniquely vampire. I could smell the blood on my clothes from my accident, already drying and oxidizing. And beneath all of it, overwhelming everything else, I could smell the humans outside, their blood, their sweat, their life. Each person had a unique scent, a signature that my newly vampiric brain cataloged automatically. I could tell who was healthy and who was sick, who was young and who was old, who was frightened and who was calm, all from scent alone. The sensory overload was overwhelming. Too much information flooding my brain all at once, more than any consciousness should have to process simultaneously. I tried to focus on just one sense, to filter out the others, but it was like trying to drink from a fire hose. Everything was cranked up to maximum intensity, and I had no idea how to control any of it. I tried to sit up, to take stock of my new situation, and discovered that my body responded with a speed and strength that shocked me. One moment I was lying down, the next I was standing beside the bed, having moved so fast that I couldn't track my own motion. It was like time had skipped, jumping forward without my conscious participation. The room spun, or maybe I was spinning. I couldn't tell anymore. My sense of balance was different now. My proprioception recalibrated for a body that was stronger, faster, more capable than my human form had ever been. I felt like I was piloting an unfamiliar vehicle, like I had been given controls I didn't understand. And beneath all the sensory chaos, beneath the disorientation and confusion, was the hunger. The hunger was unlike anything I had experienced as a human. It wasn't located in my stomach or my throat. It was deeper, more primal, more all-consuming. It was a need that went beyond physical. It was spiritual, existential, fundamental to my new existence. Every beat of those distant human hearts called to me like a siren song. Every pulse of blood through mortal veins was an invitation I could barely resist. It wasn't like being hungry for food. It was more like dying of thirst in the desert while surrounded by water you weren't allowed to drink. The need was immediate, desperate, overwhelming every other thought and sensation. My newly enhanced senses were attuned specifically to finding prey, to identifying the easiest targets, to calculating exactly how to feed most efficiently. Part of me, the part that was still Clara Valen, M.D., dedicated to saving lives and doing no harm, was horrified by these predatory instincts. But another part, the new vampire part, didn't care about my medical ethics or my oath or my commitment to healing. That part only cared about satisfying the hunger. Lucian appeared in the doorway. I don't know if he had been waiting nearby or if he had heard me move, but suddenly he was there, holding a glass filled with something dark and viscous. I knew what it was before he said anything. My enhanced senses could smell it: blood, human blood, still warm and full of life. My first instinct was to recoil. I was a doctor. I had dedicated my life to healing people, to preserving life, to making the world a better place. The thought of drinking blood, of consuming someone's life force, should have been abhorrent. It should have gone against everything I believed in, everything I had worked for. But the hunger didn't care about my beliefs. The hunger didn't care that I had taken an oath to do no harm. The hunger was a primal force that transcended morality and ethics and civilized behavior. It was the reality of what I had become. Lucian explained in his calm, measured voice that it was donated blood from a hospital blood bank, that no one had been hurt to obtain it. That drinking it didn't make me a monster, didn't make me evil, was simply the reality of vampire existence. He explained it the way a doctor might explain necessary medical treatment to a reluctant patient: factual, compassionate, but ultimately non-negotiable. His words barely registered. All I could focus on was the glass in his hand and the life force it contained. My newly vampiric instincts were screaming at me to take it, to drink, to satisfy the hunger that was threatening to consume my entire consciousness. He handed me the glass, and I drank. The first taste. The first taste of blood as a vampire was transcendent. There's really no other word for it. It was like every sense I possessed had been waiting for this moment, had been calibrated specifically for this experience. The blood was rich and warm and alive in ways that defied description. It wasn't just a liquid, it was life itself, concentrated and distilled. I could taste more than just the physical components of blood, the iron and salts and proteins. I could taste the donor's emotions, their memories, their very essence. It sounds insane, but I could feel their life flowing into me. I could sense their joy and fear and love and pain, all mixed together in the blood. I could taste their last meal, smell their favorite perfume, feel the echo of their heartbeat. It was intimate in a way that felt almost violating, like I was consuming not just their blood, but their experiences, their humanity, their very being. And it was exactly what my new body needed. The hunger that had been threatening to overwhelm me began to subside, replaced by a feeling of satisfaction and power. Each swallow sent waves of energy through my system, recharging and revitalizing me. My enhanced senses, which had been chaotic and overwhelming, began to settle into something more manageable. I finished the glass in seconds and looked up at Lucian with blood on my lips. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not disgust, thank God, but something like recognition mixed with sadness. He had been through this himself, I realized. Centuries ago, he had experienced his own first feeding, had felt the same confusion and horror and desperate need. He told me it would get easier, that the hunger would become manageable with time and practice, that I would learn to control it rather than letting it control me, that I could feed ethically, could satisfy my needs without becoming a monster, could balance my vampiric nature with the humanity I was trying to preserve. But in that moment, with a stranger's life force flowing through my veins and blood staining my teeth, I wasn't sure I believed him. I looked down at my hands, hands that had spent years learning to heal, to help, to save. They were paler now, almost luminous in the dim light. The veins were less visible, the skin smoother and more perfect than it had ever been as a human. But they were also stronger, more dangerous. I could feel the power in them, could sense that I could crush bone as easily as I had once set it. What had I become? The question hung in the air between us, unspoken but present. I had made a choice on that dark street survival over death, whatever the cost. And the cost was this: becoming a predator, a creature that fed on human blood, something that existed in the shadows and hid from the sun. I had traded my humanity for immortality. And looking at the blood on my hands, I wasn't sure I had made the right choice. Learning to be a monster, the first few days of my new existence were a crash course in being a vampire. Lucian stayed with me constantly, patient and methodical, teaching me everything I needed to know to survive in this new form. Breathing was the first lesson, which seemed ridiculous. I had been breathing automatically for 28 years. How hard could it be? But vampire bodies don't need oxygen the way human bodies do. Our blood doesn't carry oxygen to our cells. It's powered by something else, something mystical that I still don't fully understand. We don't need to breathe at all, but humans breathe. And if I wanted to pass as human, if I wanted to exist in human society without immediately being recognized as a predator, I would need to fake it. Lucian taught me to time my breaths, to make them look natural even though they served no biological purpose. He taught me to sigh at appropriate moments, to gasp when surprised, to pant when supposedly exerted. Every human reaction I had once done automatically now required conscious effort and practice. Movement was another challenge. The strength and speed that came with vampirism were intoxicating but dangerous. The first morning, though I slept through most mornings now, finding daylight uncomfortable even through closed curtains, I tried to open a door and tore the knob clean off. I picked up a coffee mug and crushed it to powder in my hand. I tried to brush my hair and snapped the brush handle like a twig. Everything required recalibration. My vampire body was capable of things my human body could never have done, but that meant I had to relearn even the most basic tasks. Lucienne made me practice picking up eggs without breaking them, holding paper without tearing it, touching things with the delicate precision required to exist in a human world. It was exhausting, requiring constant concentration, but gradually I began to master it. Speed was even stranger. I discovered I could move faster than the human eye could track. I had accidentally appeared across the room without remembering the journey, frightening both myself and Lucian. Vampire speed wasn't like running fast. It was more like time shifted around us, like we existed in a different temporal frame where seconds stretched and movements became instant. But using that speed in public would expose us immediately. So Lucian taught me to move slowly, deliberately, to fake the limitations of a human body even though I no longer had any, to walk instead of blur, to take stairs instead of leaping up them in a single bound, to pretend to be tired when I could run for hours without breaking a sweat. The hardest lessons weren't physical, though. They were emotional and psychological. I had to learn how to exist in a world where I was fundamentally different from everyone around me, where I was a predator surrounded by prey, where my continued survival depended on feeding from the very people I had dedicated my human life to helping. Lucian taught me about the vampire world, the hidden society that existed in the shadows of human civilization. He explained the rules, the politics, the dangers. He told me about other vampires, about how they varied in age and power and temperament. He warned me about the Council of Elders and the laws they enforced with ruthless efficiency. But even as he prepared me for vampire society, the most painful lesson was yet to come, learning to let go of my human life. Funeral for the living. Lucian had arranged everything perfectly. The police report listed me as a hit-and-run fatality. The body in the morgue, I didn't ask where he got it, and he didn't volunteer. The information was identified as Clara Valen through dental records that had been subtly altered. An autopsy was performed, listing my cause of death as massive internal trauma. Death certificate issued. Case closed. My funeral was scheduled for 2 weeks after my transformation. 2 weeks that I spent in Lucian's warehouse, learning to be a vampire while my family and friends prepared to bury me. 2 weeks of watching obituaries and reading condolence messages on social media, and realizing that everyone I cared about thought I was dead. They were right, in a way. Clara Valen the human had died on that street corner. The thing I had become was something else, someone else. But that didn't make it any easier. Lucian tried to talk me out of going to the funeral. He said it was dangerous, that maintaining any connection to my human life would make the transition harder. He warned me about the emotional toll, about how painful it would be to watch my loved ones mourn me while I stood invisibly in the shadows. But I needed to go. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to have some kind of closure, to say goodbye even if they didn't know I was there. He understood, I think. He had his own ghosts, his own regrets about people he had left behind when he was turned. He didn't agree with my decision, but he supported it. The funeral was held at the church my family had attended when I was growing up. I hadn't been particularly religious medical school, and residency had left little time for Sunday services, but my parents had insisted on a traditional ceremony. The November evening was cold and gray, threatening rain that never quite materialized. I stood across the street, hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree, watching people arrive. The November air was cold, I knew, because I saw people shivering and pulling their coats tighter, though I no longer felt temperature the way humans did. My vampire body maintained a constant cool temperature regardless of external conditions. Sarah was there, of course. My best friend since medical school, the one person who had been through everything with me. She arrived early, helping my parents from their car, supporting my mother who looked like she might collapse at any moment. Sarah was crying before she even entered the church, her face destroyed by grief. We had been through so much together. All-night study sessions during medical school, the terror of our first codes, the exhaustion of our first year of residency. We had promised to be at each other's weddings, to be godmothers to each other's children, to grow old together comparing stories about our grandchildren. And now she was at my funeral, sobbing like her heart had been ripped out, and I couldn't even tell her I was still here. My attending physician arrived next, Dr. Martinez, the one who had been supervising my residency. He looked older than I remembered, tired and sad. He had written me a letter of recommendation just 2 weeks before my death, talking about my promise as a physician, my compassion for patients, my dedication to the profession. Now he was here to mourn that lost potential. Other residents from the hospital came in groups, still wearing their scrubs under their coats, having come directly from their shifts. I recognized most of them colleagues I had worked with, studied with, complained to about the brutal hours and impossible demands of residency. They looked shell-shocked, probably thinking about how easily it could have been them, how random and unfair death could be. But the worst was watching my parents arrive. My father looked like he had aged a decade in the 2 weeks since my death. His hair seemed grayer, his shoulders more stooped, his movements slow and mechanical like he was moving through water. My mother couldn't stop crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that I could hear clearly despite the distance. They held each other up, two broken people trying to survive the unsurvivable loss of their only child. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to them, to tell them I was alive, that they didn't need to mourn, that I was right here. But I couldn't, because Clara Valen the human was dead, and what I was now, this thing that looked like her but fed on blood and hid from sunlight, couldn't be part of their world anymore. The service was beautiful, I suppose. I couldn't hear most of it from my position across the street, but I could see through the church windows, could watch the ceremony with my enhanced vision. Dr. Martinez gave a eulogy about what a promising doctor I had been, how I had had a gift for connecting with patients, how the world had lost something precious. Sarah spoke too, though she broke down several times and had to pause to collect herself. They played my favorite song, something I had mentioned to Sarah years ago. Surprised she remembered. They showed photos on a screen, images of my life from childhood through medical school. Everyone cried. Everyone mourned. And I stood in the shadows across the street, crying blood-red tears that I had to wipe away quickly before anyone might see. After the service, they processed to the cemetery. I followed at a distance, moving through shadows, using my vampire speed to stay ahead of the cars. The gravesite was in an older section of the cemetery, near some trees that provided good cover. I watched from behind a large headstone as they lowered the casket into the ground. An empty casket. There was no body inside, just weight to make it feel real. But my parents didn't know that. They thought they were burying their daughter, laying her to rest, saying their final goodbye. My mother collapsed at the graveside, literally fell to her knees in the dirt, wailing in a way that sounded like something was being torn out of her. My father knelt beside her, holding her while his own tears fell silently. Sarah stood nearby, one hand covering her mouth, the other clutching a tissue that was already soaked through. I felt something break inside me, some last connection to my human life, some final thread that had been holding me together. I was dead to them. Really, truly dead. They were never going to know that I survived, that I was still here, that I was watching them grieve. I would exist forever in the shadows while they moved on, eventually healed, eventually learned to live with the hole I had left in their lives. Lucian found me after everyone had left, after the groundskeeper had filled in the grave and gone home. I was still standing there, staring at the fresh earth that supposedly covered my remains. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me in the darkness, a quiet presence in my grief. Then, in his soft, measured voice, he began to speak about loss, about the people he had left behind when he was turned a family he had loved, friends who had mattered, a life he had been torn away from. He spoke about the weight of immortality, about watching generations live and die while you remain unchanged, about the grief that accumulates over centuries. He told me he had stood at gravesides like this dozens of times. His parents, his siblings, his friends from his human life. Later, people he had met as a vampire and grown close to, only to watch them age and die while he stayed young. He said the pain never really went away, but you learned to carry it. Learn to honor the dead by continuing to live, to find meaning and purpose in the endless years ahead. His words were careful, chosen with the precision of someone who had centuries to learn how to comfort the grieving. But beneath the careful words, I could hear his own pain. This wasn't theoretical for him. He had lived this loss over and over again, had buried everyone he had ever cared about, had survived grief that would have destroyed someone with less strength. I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since I woke up as a vampire. Why me? Why had he chosen to save me, to turn me, to condemn us both to potential execution by the council? Why had he risked everything for a stranger bleeding out on a dark street? He was quiet for a long time, his ancient eyes fixed on my empty grave. When he finally answered, his words were careful, as if he was revealing something he didn't usually share. He said he had been watching me for weeks before the accident. Not stalking, he made that clear but observing. He made a habit of visiting hospitals, watching doctors work, looking for something specific. He was looking for people who still cared, who hadn't been broken by the system, who treated their patients as humans rather than cases. He said he saw me with a homeless patient one night, saw me spend an extra 20 minutes talking to him, treating him with dignity and respect when other doctors had dismissed him. He saw me cry in the break room after losing a young patient to cancer. He saw me working double shifts when we were understaffed, pushing myself to exhaustion because patients needed help. He said he saw compassion in me that he hadn't seen in a long time, a genuine desire to heal, to help, to make the world better. And he realized that the vampire world needed that just as much as the human world did, maybe more. He said he was tired of watching potential die, tired of seeing lights extinguished before their time, tired of existing in a world where following the rules meant letting brilliance fade into nothing. He said he would rather face the council's judgment than live with the regret of letting another exceptional person slip away. And in that moment, standing in the cemetery where my human self was supposedly buried, I understood something fundamental about Lucian Drax. He wasn't just old and powerful and knowledgeable. He was desperately, achingly lonely. He had lived for centuries watching the world change, watching people live and die, never really connecting with anyone because the temporary nature of human life made deep connections too painful. In saving me, he had also saved himself. He had given himself purpose, given himself someone to protect and teach and care about. He had taken an enormous risk not just to preserve my potential, but to rescue himself from the isolation that had been slowly crushing him for decades. We stood there in silence for a while longer, two vampires mourning a human life that was gone forever. Then, together, we turned and walked away from my grave, away from my human past, toward whatever future this strange new life would hold. Part 2. The Vampire World. Over the following weeks, Lucian began my true education in being a vampire. It wasn't enough to control my strength and speed, to manage my hunger and fake human reactions. I needed to understand the world I now inhabited, the hidden society that existed in the shadows of human civilization. Vampires, Lucian explained, were everywhere. They had been walking among humans for thousands of years, maybe longer. No one knew exactly when the first vampire came into existence. There were legends and theories, but nothing definitive. What mattered was that they existed now, hidden in plain sight, living in every major city in the world. They were business owners and artists, politicians and criminals, scholars and soldiers. They had built a parallel civilization, one with its own rules and hierarchies and power structures. They had their own economy, funded by centuries of accumulated wealth, their own justice system, enforced by beings old enough to remember the fall of Rome, their own culture, mixing ancient traditions with modern adaptation. The key to their survival was the masquerade, the absolute necessity of remaining hidden from humanity. Most humans never knew vampires existed. Those who did were either part of the system willing blood donors, employees, protectors, or didn't live long enough to tell anyone. The masquerade was maintained through careful control, strategic influence, and when necessary, ruthless elimination of threats. Lucian took me to my first vampire gathering in my 3rd week as a vampire. It was held in what looked like an abandoned theater in the Arts District, another place that seemed derelict from outside but was opulent within. The contrast was intentional, he explained. Vampires had learned long ago that looking poor was the best way to avoid human attention and interference. Inside, the theater was spectacular. The ceiling had been restored to its original ornate beauty, complete with carved angels and gold leaf that caught the candlelight. The stage was set up like a formal dining hall, though none of the vampires would be eating food. The seats had been removed and replaced with intimate seating areas, luxurious couches and chairs arranged for conversation. Dozens of vampires were already there when we arrived, mingling and talking like any other social gathering. But the differences were immediately apparent to my enhanced senses. Everyone was preternaturally beautiful. Vampire transformation seemed to perfect physical features, making even average humans stunning. Everyone moved with an inhuman grace that spoke of strength and speed barely contained. And everyone had that same amber glow in their eyes, a reflection of the predator within. I was terrified. These were predators, every one of them. Beings who had killed to survive, maybe not regularly, but enough. Creatures who had lived for decades or centuries, accumulating power and knowledge and experience that I couldn't hope to match. And I was supposed to fit in here, supposed to be one of them. But Lucian's hand was steady on my back, his presence a shield against my fear. He introduced me around, and I met vampires who had lived through history I had only read about in books. Isabella had been a queen in medieval Spain, turned to prevent a political crisis that would have led to war. She still carried herself with royal bearing, wearing jewelry that was probably worth more than most people made in a lifetime. She asked intelligent questions about my medical training, curious about modern medicine and how it had advanced since her turning. Marcus had been turned during the American Civil War, a Union soldier who had been dying from infected wounds when a vampire surgeon gave him a choice similar to the one Lucian had offered me. He was fascinated by how warfare had changed, how technology had transformed conflict, though he mourned the loss of what he called honor in battle. Yuki had been a samurai's daughter in feudal Japan, turned by a vampire who had been impressed by her courage during a battle. Now she ran a successful tech company, having adapted to modern life with remarkable flexibility. She spoke with enthusiasm about how the internet had changed vampire society, how it was now possible to communicate and coordinate in ways that would have seemed like magic even 50 years ago. Each of them was curious about me, the newest vampire in the city, still learning the basics, still figuring out who I was in this new existence. They asked questions about my transformation, my adjustment, my plans. Some were kind and welcoming, offering advice and support. Others were more skeptical, pointing out that I had been illegally created, that my maker would face consequences for turning me without permission. That was when I learned about the Council of Elders. When Lucian mentioned them, the entire atmosphere in the theater shifted. Conversations quieted. Vampires glanced at each other nervously. Even the oldest vampires and attendance beings who had lived for centuries showed visible discomfort. The council was the supreme authority in the vampire world, Lucian explained in a quiet voice. 5 beings so old they barely seemed real anymore. They had been alive when humans were still figuring out agriculture, when the first cities were being built, when civilization itself was just beginning. They had watched empires rise and fall, had seen the entire span of recorded human history unfold before their ancient eyes. They enforced the laws that governed vampire society. They maintained the masquerade, ensuring that vampires remained hidden from humanity. They judged disputes between vampires, rendered verdicts that could not be appealed, and executed their decisions with ruthless efficiency. They were judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into beings of unimaginable power. And the most important law, the one that Lucian had broken, was about creation. Vampires couldn't just turn anyone they wanted. Each new vampire had to be approved by the council, vetted to ensure they would be valuable additions to vampire society. The council controlled vampire population carefully, making sure there were never too many predators competing for food, never too many unstable newly turned vampires risking exposure. Unauthorized transformations were absolutely forbidden. The penalty was death immediate, final, not subject to appeal or clemency. Death for both the maker and the newly created vampire. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. Lucien had saved my life. Yes, but in doing so, he had signed both our death warrants. Unless we could somehow convince the council that my transformation was justified, that I deserved to exist, we would both be executed, destroyed, ended completely, after all his centuries of existence and my brief moment as a vampire. I confronted him about it that night, back at his warehouse after the gathering. I demanded to know why he hadn't told me sooner, why he had taken such an enormous risk, why he had gambled both our lives on a stranger he barely knew. His answer was simple and devastating. He said he was tired of watching people die, tired of seeing potential extinguished, tired of living in a world where following the rules meant letting brilliance fade into nothing. He had lived for centuries according to the council's laws, had watched countless exceptional humans live and die without ever having the chance to become more. He said he had decided that if he was going to be destroyed, it would be for doing something worthwhile, for saving someone who mattered, for giving a compassionate, skilled healer the chance to continue her work for centuries, instead of dying at 28 in a pointless accident. He said he would rather face execution for doing what was right than continue existing in safe, sterile isolation, following rules that preserved a system he no longer believed in. In that moment, I realized the true depth of Lucien's loneliness and his courage. He wasn't just ancient and powerful, He was a being who had lived so long that he had lost faith in the very society he was part of, and in saving me, he had found a purpose worth dying for. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. Someone had risked everything for me, not just their life, but centuries of accumulated existence, knowledge, experience. How could I possibly be worth that? How could I justify that sacrifice? But I also understood that I couldn't let him face the council alone. If we were going to be judged, we would face that judgment together. And somehow, some way, we would convince the council that my transformation, illegal though it was, had value. We would prove that I deserved to exist. Ethan. 3 weeks after my transformation, Lucian came home with a child. At least, that's what he looked like, a boy of maybe 12, thin and wearing clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store circa 1950. But the way Lucian introduced him told me immediately that appearance was deceiving. Ethan was a vampire. Had been a vampire for over a century. He had been turned at 12 years old and would remain 12 years old forever, watching the world change around him while trapped in a body that would never grow up, never mature, never become the adult he should have been. Lucian explained that he had found Ethan living in an abandoned subway tunnel, surviving on rats and the occasional homeless person who wandered too far from safety. His maker had been destroyed shortly after turning him executed for an unrelated crime, leaving Ethan alone and terrified in a world he didn't understand. He had been hiding for over 100 years, never aging, never fitting in, never truly living. When I first saw him, huddled in the corner of Lucien's living room, something fundamental shifted in my chest. My maternal instincts, which I thought had been buried with my humanity, roared to life with an intensity that surprised me. This child, this eternal child, needed help, needed family, needed someone to care. I approached him slowly, carefully, the way you approach a frightened animal. I introduced myself, told him he was safe here, that no one would hurt him. He looked at me with eyes that were simultaneously too young and far too old, and I saw recognition there. Not of me specifically, but of someone who might understand what it felt like to be lost and afraid, and struggling to survive in a world that seemed designed for everyone except you. Over the following days, Ethan slowly began to trust me. He started talking, hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness. He told me about his transformation, a vampire who had lost control while feeding, who had drained him to the point of death, and then, in a moment of guilt or mercy, given him vampire blood to save his life. He told me about watching his maker being hunted down and destroyed, about hiding in the shadows while vampire enforcers searched for any progeny that might have been created. He described the decades that followed the fear of being discovered, the hunger that he didn't understand, the loneliness of being forever trapped as a child in a world that moved forward without him. He had watched the 1920s become the 1950s, become the 1990s, become the 2020s, always from the outside, always alone, always 12 years old. He described trying to go to school, but his eternal youth made it impossible. How do you explain that you're the same age every year? He described trying to make friends, but the difference between him and actual children was too vast. He had the mind of someone over a century old trapped in a child's body. He described the desperate isolation of existence that didn't fit anywhere, wasn't wanted by anyone. The more he talked, the more my heart broke for him. I had only been a vampire for 3 weeks, but I already understood how difficult the transition was. I couldn't imagine surviving it alone as a child, without guidance or support or even basic instruction on how to feed properly. I used my medical training to help him first. I explained the biology of vampire transformation in terms he could grasp, helped him understand what had happened to his body and why. I taught him better feeding techniques he had been surviving on animals, which left him perpetually weak and malnourished. I showed him how to hunt ethically, how to feed from donated blood, how to satisfy his needs without killing. But more importantly, I gave him something he had been missing for over a century: family. Not the family he had lost. His parents and siblings were long dead, but a new family, a chosen family, a family that understood what he was and loved him anyway. Ethan began calling me his sister. It made sense. We were both relatively young in vampire years, both under Lucian's protection, both trying to figure out how to exist in this impossible life. But it meant more than just a convenient label. It meant belonging. It meant that even in this dark new world, Even as monsters, we could have love and connection. Watching Ethan slowly transform not physically, but emotionally was one of the most rewarding experiences of my new life. He began to smile more, to talk more freely, to show the sense of humor and quick intelligence that had been buried under a century of trauma and isolation. He was smart, kind, resilient in ways that humbled me. The three of us, Lucian, Ethan, and I, began to form something that felt like a real family. Lucian was the patriarch, ancient and wise and protective, carrying the weight of centuries with quiet strength. Ethan was the eternal child, bringing light and hope and unexpected wisdom into our darkness. And I was, what? The bridge between them? The healer? The one who held us together with compassion and determination? I didn't know, but I knew it felt right. Despite everything I had lost, despite the monstrous existence I had been thrust into, I had gained something precious. I had gained a family that chose me, that needed me, that I could protect and care for. And that made the impossible sacrifice of my human life feel just a little bit more bearable. Part 3. Judgment Day. The summons from the council arrived exactly 2 months after my transformation. It came in the form of a vampire I had never met, a tall, severe woman with platinum blonde hair and eyes like chips of ice. She appeared at Lucien's door precisely at midnight, as if she had been waiting for the clock to strike before announcing her presence. She carried a sealed envelope bearing a mark I didn't recognize, but that made Lucien's face go pale when he saw it. 3 interlocking circles, rendered in what looked like dried blood on parchment that was probably centuries old. The council's seal. The symbol that meant judgment was coming. Inside was a formal notice, written in elegant calligraphy that must have been done by hand. It informed us that the Council of Elders had become aware of my unauthorized transformation. It required both Lucian and me to appear before them in exactly 1 week to account for my existence and make our case for why I should be allowed to continue existing. The letter was polite, formal, written in language that was probably archaic even by vampire standards. But beneath the courteous words was a clear threat. If we couldn't justify my transformation, if we couldn't convince the council that I had value, we would both be destroyed. No appeal, no mercy. Final. Lucian spent the next week preparing me with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He coached me on proper vampire etiquette, how to bow, how to speak, how to show respect without appearing weak. He told me about each council member, describing their personalities and prejudices in detail. Morgana was the oldest and most powerful, supposedly over 3,000 years old. She had lived through the rise and fall of ancient Egypt, had watched humanity evolve from Bronze Age tribes to spacefaring civilization. She could read thoughts, he warned me, see into souls, perceive truths that others tried to hide. There would be no lying to her, no deception, no hiding who I really was. Victor had been a Roman general during the height of the empire, turned by a vampire who wanted a military strategist. He valued strength, discipline, loyalty above all else. He would respect competence but had no patience for weakness or excuses. I would need to demonstrate that I could be useful, that I could contribute to vampire society in meaningful ways. Alessandra had been a healer during the Renaissance, a woman who had devoted her human life to medicine before being turned. She was our best hope for an ally. She might understand my background, might see value in having another healer among vampire ranks. But Lucian warned me not to rely on her sympathy. She was still a council member, still committed to vampire law above personal preference. Chen was said to be the oldest vampire in existence, turned so long ago that he remembered when humans were just beginning to use fire. He spoke rarely, but when he did, even the other council members listened. Lucian didn't know much about him. Chen was an enigma even to vampires who had lived for centuries. Isabella had been a queen in medieval Europe, turned to prevent a war that would have devastated both human and vampire populations. She understood politics, power, the delicate balance of maintaining order. She would evaluate me not just on my individual worth, but on what precedent my survival would set for vampire society. Lucian drilled me relentlessly. He made me practice my responses to potential questions, refine my arguments, strengthen my case. He taught me how to project confidence without arrogance, competence without threatening established power structures. Every word, every gesture, every expression mattered. One mistake could mean death. Ethan watched our preparations with growing anxiety. He had managed to hide from the council for over a century, staying under their radar through sheer luck and desperation. But bringing me into their attention risked exposing him too. If they investigated Lucian's household thoroughly, they would find another unauthorized vampire, another illegal transformation. We could all be destroyed. But Lucian assured him and me that he would keep Ethan's secret. That he had ways to hide him, to ensure the council's attention remained focused on me. I wasn't sure I believed him, but Ethan seemed to trust him, and I had to trust that Lucian knew what he was doing. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Not that vampires need much sleep anyway. We can go days without it if necessary, but I had gotten into the habit of resting during daylight hours. That night, though, rest was impossible. My mind raced through every possible scenario, every argument and counter-argument, every way the hearing could go wrong. I paced Lucian's warehouse for hours, my enhanced speed eating up the distance as I walked back and forth, trying to burn off nervous energy that had nowhere else to go. I thought about everything that had led to this moment: the car accident, the transformation, the loss of my human life, the discovery of vampire society, my connection with Lucian and Ethan. I thought about my parents, still grieving the daughter they thought they had lost, about Sarah, who had gotten engaged last week according to her social media I still checked sometimes, unable to completely let go, about the medical career I would never have, the patients I would never help in the traditional sense. But I also thought about Maya, the first vampire I had helped at the transition center, and the other newly turned vampires who had come through our doors. I thought about Ethan and how much he had grown in just a few weeks of having family and support. I thought about the potential I had to help others like them, to use my medical knowledge to ease vampire transitions, to make immortality a little less lonely and terrifying. I thought about Lucian, about the risk he had taken for me, about the centuries of existence he was willing to sacrifice because he believed I was worth saving. How could I let him down? How could I fail to prove that his faith in me was justified? Lucian found me in the early morning hours, standing by a window watching the city wake up. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I couldn't go out in it anymore. Vampire bodies didn't burst into flame in sunlight like the movies suggested, but it was extremely painful and debilitating. But I could watch it from behind treated glass, could see the dawn even if I could never experience it again. He stood beside me in silence for a long moment, both of us watching the sun rise over a city that was mine, but also fundamentally alien now. Then he began to speak, his voice quiet and reflective, telling me about his own transformation so many centuries ago. He had been a nobleman in medieval France, he said. Young, wealthy, privileged, living a life of comfort and ease. He had been riding home late one night when he was attacked by bandits. They beat him, robbed him, left him dying in a ditch by the side of the road. A vampire found him there, a merchant who had been turned centuries earlier and who still maintained enough humanity to feel compassion for a dying young man. The merchant gave him the same choice Lucian had given me, death or transformation. Lucian chose life and woke up as a vampire. He described the centuries that followed the wars he witnessed, the plagues he survived, the endless march of human progress that he watched from the shadows. He talked about the friends he made and lost, the humans he grew close to only to watch them age and die. He described the loneliness that had defined so much of his existence, the feeling of being a permanent outsider, of never really belonging anywhere. But he also talked about the moments of beauty he had witnessed. The invention of the printing press, which revolutionized human knowledge. The first flight, which showed humans could achieve the impossible. The moon landing, which proved that even the stars weren't beyond reach. The small, precious moments of human brilliance that made immortality worthwhile. He said that every vampire carried trauma from their transformation wounds that never quite healed even with centuries of time. But those wounds could become sources of strength if you let them. They could give you empathy for others, suffering, could help you understand pain in ways that made it possible to ease others' pain. He said that's why he had saved me, because he saw someone who had already dedicated her life to healing others' wounds, and he realized that if anyone could use the trauma of transformation to help other vampires, it would be me. His words gave me courage. Whatever happened at the hearing, whatever the council decided, I would face it with dignity. I would make them understand that my life, my new, strange, impossible life had value, that I could contribute something meaningful to vampire society, that Lucian's risk had been worth taking. I would prove that I deserved to exist. The council chamber. The council's headquarters was hidden beneath the city's oldest cathedral, accessible only through a series of tunnels that had been carved out centuries before the cathedral itself was built. Lucian led the way through the maze with confident steps, having been there before. I followed close behind, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. The tunnels were ancient, carved from living rock by hands that had probably been dust for 1,000 years. The walls were covered in symbols I didn't recognize, vampire writing perhaps, or something even older. Blue flames burned in sconces set into the walls, giving off light but no heat, fueled by something that definitely wasn't normal fire. We descended for what felt like miles, though it was probably just a few hundred feet. The pressure of the earth above us was palpable, the weight of centuries of vampire history literally pressing down. I could feel my vampire instincts screaming warnings going underground, like this was dangerous, was a trap, was giving up the advantage of escape. But there was no escape, not from this. The only way out was through. We finally emerged into a chamber so vast it took my breath away metaphorically, since I didn't actually need to breathe. The ceiling disappeared into darkness far above, higher than should have been possible underground. The walls were covered in carved reliefs depicting vampire history, great battles, momentous events, the faces of vampires long gone to dust. The floor was polished marble that reflected the blue torchlight like water, and at the far end of the chamber, on thrones that looked like they had grown from the stone itself, sat the Council of Elders. 5 beings so old, so powerful, that my newly turned vampire senses screamed in terror just from their presence. Each one radiated an aura that was almost physical, pressing against me like a weight, making it hard to think, hard to stand, hard to do anything except submit to their ancient authority. Morgana sat in the center. She appeared to be a woman in her 30s, but appeared was the operative word. Everything about her screamed age beyond age. Her eyes were completely black, no whites, no irises, just fathomless darkness that seemed to look straight through physical form to see the soul beneath. Her hair was silver, not gray, flowing down her back like liquid metal. The air around her shimmered with power that even I could see. To her right sat Victor, looking exactly like what he was, a Roman general transported forward 2,000 years. He had the build of a warrior, all muscle and controlled strength, even though vampires don't actually need to maintain physical fitness. His eyes were sharp, calculating, missing nothing. He wore modern clothes, but his bearing was pure ancient Rome command, discipline, the absolute certainty of someone who had led armies to victory. To Morgana's left was Alessandra. She appeared younger than the others, maybe mid-20s, with auburn hair and gentle eyes. But gentle was deceiving. I could sense the steel beneath her surface kindness, the ruthlessness that had allowed her to survive for centuries. She looked at me with what might have been sympathy, but I couldn't be sure. Vampires who lived that long learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of civility. Chen sat on the far right, and just looking at him made me dizzy. He appeared elderly, despite vampiric immortality, thin, frail-looking, with long white hair and a face like ancient parchment. But the power emanating from him was overwhelming. He was the oldest thing I had ever been in the presence of. Older than civilizations, older than written language, older than most of human achievement. His eyes held the weight of millennia, and meeting them felt like staring into an abyss that went back to the dawn of human consciousness. Isabella sat on the far left, looking every inch the queen she had been in life. Dark hair arranged in elaborate medieval braids, jewelry that was probably worth a fortune, clothes that managed to be both period-appropriate and timeless. Her gaze was calculating, political, evaluating me not as a person, but as a piece in some larger game I couldn't see. The 5 of them together created an atmosphere of power so intense it was almost physical. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to hide, to get away from these apex predators who could destroy me with a thought. But I forced myself to stand still, to maintain the composure Lucian had drilled into me, to project confidence even though I was terrified. Morgana spoke first, her voice echoing through the chamber with a resonance that felt like it came from the earth itself. She acknowledged our presence, stated the charge against us unauthorized transformation of a human, and asked if we had anything to say in our defense. Lucian stepped forward. His voice was steady, respectful but not servile, carrying the confidence of someone who had lived for centuries and faced death more times than most people could imagine. He explained the circumstances of my accident, the drunk driver, the catastrophic injuries, the certainty of my death. He explained his decision to save me, his reasoning, his calculation of the value I could bring to vampire society. He spoke about my medical training, about my skills as a doctor, about the potential I had to help newly turned vampires understand and adapt to their transformations. He presented me not as a burden or a mistake, but as an opportunity, someone who could bridge the gap between human medicine and vampire healing, someone who could reduce the high mortality rate among recent transformations that had plagued vampire society for centuries. When he finished, Morgana turned her attention to me. The weight of her gaze was crushing, like being examined under a microscope by some alien intelligence that could see every secret, every fear, every hidden thought. I felt her presence in my mind not intrusively, but present, like she was reading the surface of my consciousness the way I might read a book. She asked me a single question, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What do you want?" Such a simple question, such a profound question. What did I want from existence? What did I want from immortality? What made me worth the risk Lucian had taken? What made me worth keeping alive? I took a breath. I didn't need more to steady myself than anything else, and answered honestly. Because Lucian had been right. There was no lying to Morgana. She would see through any deception instantly. The only chance I had was to be completely, vulnerably truthful. I told them about Ethan, about finding this child who had been alone for over a century, who had been surviving rather than living, who had needed help that no one had given him. I told them about realizing that there must be others like him, vampires who had been turned traumatically, who didn't understand what was happening to them, who were suffering without guidance or support. I told them about my training as a doctor, about how I had dedicated my human life to healing and helping others. I said that transformation shouldn't end that mission, it should expand it. That vampires needed healers too, needed people who understood both the medical and psychological aspects of their existence, who could help them transition from human to vampire without the trauma and danger that had defined so many transformations. I told them that I wanted to create a systematic approach to helping newly turned vampires, to teach them control, understanding, acceptance, to prevent the kind of desperate, dangerous existence that led to exposure and execution, to reduce vampire mortality, increase successful integrations into vampire society, make immortality less of a curse and more of an opportunity. I told them that I hadn't asked for this life, but now that I had it, I wanted it to mean something. I wanted to help. I wanted to heal. I wanted to prove that a life taken without consent could become a life that gave back to the community. That trauma could be transformed into purpose. That even in darkness, there could be light. When I finished, silence fell over the chamber. The council members looked at each other, and I felt something pass between them, some kind of communication that went beyond words, beyond thoughts, a communion of ancient minds sharing information too complex for newer vampires like me to comprehend. Then they began to question me. Victor asked about logistics. How would I feed without killing? How would I maintain the masquerade while working with unstable, newly turned vampires? What security measures would prevent my work from exposing vampire society? His questions were sharp, military, designed to find weaknesses in my plan. I answered carefully, drawing on my medical training to present systematic solutions. I explained about using donated blood from hospital blood banks, about creating secure facilities specifically designed for vampire care, about vetting procedures to ensure only vampires who could be helped safely would be admitted. I outlined security protocols, emergency procedures, contingency plans. I spoke with the confidence of someone presenting a medical proposal to a hospital board. translating my human expertise into vampire terms. Alessandra asked about my own stability. How could I help others when I was barely 2 months old myself? How did I know I wouldn't lose control, wouldn't become the very danger I was trying to prevent? What made me think I was ready for this responsibility? I answered honestly. I acknowledged my youth, my inexperience, my limitations, but I also pointed out that recent transformation was actually an advantage. I remembered what it felt like to be human, remembered the fear and confusion of becoming a vampire with vivid clarity that older vampires might have lost. That empathy would make me more effective, not less. And I had Lucien's guidance, centuries of his experience to draw on, support from someone who understood both the medical and vampire aspects of my mission. Isabella asked about precedent. If they allowed me to live despite being illegally created, what message would that send? Would other vampires start turning humans without permission, claiming noble intentions? Would the council's authority be undermined? What about maintaining order and control over vampire society? This was the dangerous question, the political one. I chose my words very carefully. I said that my case was unique, that Lucien had saved me from certain death, not transformed me on a whim. That I had skills and training that made me genuinely valuable, not just potentially useful. That allowing me to prove my worth before final judgment was different from blanket permission for unauthorized transformations. That the council could treat my case as an exception that proved the rule rather than setting a new precedent. Chen, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried absolute authority that made even the other council members turn to listen. He asked me about my humanity, whether I still felt it, whether I mourned it, whether I would cling to it or embrace what I had become, whether I would always be torn between two worlds, or could I find peace in being a vampire who remembered being human? This question went deeper than the others, probing at the core of my identity, asking me to examine something I hadn't fully processed myself. I thought about it carefully before answering, knowing that Chen more than any of the others would sense even the slightest dishonesty. I told him that, yes, I mourned my humanity, my family, my friends, my human life. I would grieve those losses forever. But mourning wasn't the same as rejection. I could acknowledge the loss while accepting what I had become. The best vampires, I said, were probably the ones who held on to their humanity while embracing their vampiric nature. Compassion and predation weren't incompatible. Healing and hunting could coexist. I could be a vampire and still care about helping others. I could feed on blood and still preserve human values like compassion and purpose. Chen nodded slowly, and I thought I saw approval in his ancient eyes. But with beings that old, it was impossible to be certain. Finally, Morgana stood. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. She was the final authority, the ultimate judge. Her word would be law, and there would be no appeal from her decision. She spoke about the laws that governed vampire society, about how they had been established over millennia to maintain order and prevent chaos. She acknowledged that these laws were important, that they couldn't be set aside lightly, that exceptions created dangerous precedents. But she also spoke about the problems vampire society faced: the high mortality rate among newly turned vampires, the lack of systematic support for transformations, the waste of potential that occurred when new vampires failed to adapt. She said that these problems had existed for centuries, that the council had been aware of them, but hadn't found an adequate solution. She said that perhaps it was time to address these issues systematically, rather than continuing to lose potential through neglect and ignorance. That maybe having a healer who understood both human medicine and vampire existence could benefit their society in ways they hadn't previously considered. Then she gave us her verdict. I would be granted a probationary period of 3 months. During that time, I would establish a program to help newly turned vampires, a transition center where they could receive guidance, support, and medical care. I would document my methods, track outcomes, demonstrate measurable positive impact. If I succeeded, if I could prove that my existence benefited vampire society more than my destruction would, my transformation would be sanctioned retroactively. If I failed, if I proved to be more liability than asset, if my work created problems rather than solving them, if I couldn't demonstrate clear value, both Lucien and I would face immediate execution. No second chances. No appeals. Final. It wasn't a pardon. It wasn't acceptance. It was a test, a trial period, a chance to earn my life rather than having it given freely. But it was more than I had dared to hope for. It was an opportunity. I accepted without hesitation, bowing deeply to show my gratitude and respect. As we left the council chamber, climbing back through those labyrinthine tunnels toward the world above, I felt something I hadn't felt since my transformation. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. I had 3 months to prove my worth, 3 months to build something meaningful, 3 months to save not just my own life, but Lucian's as well. It would be enough. It had to be enough. Building something meaningful. The next 3 months were the most intense and purposeful of both my lives, human and vampire combined. Lucian and I threw ourselves into establishing the transition center with single-minded determination. We had a deadline hanging over us like an executioner's blade, and failure was literally not an option. We found a location in the warehouse district, another abandoned building that looked derelict from outside but could be made comfortable within. Lucian used his centuries of accumulated wealth to fund renovations. We created treatment rooms, living quarters, training spaces. We installed security systems that could detect both vampires and humans, established protocols for emergencies, set up communication networks. But the physical space was just the beginning. The real work was developing systems and programs to actually help newly turned vampires. I drew on everything I had learned in medical school, adapting techniques for vampire needs. I created intake procedures to assess each vampire's specific challenges. I developed treatment plans that addressed both physical control and psychological trauma. I designed curricula for teaching feeding ethics, social integration, and long-term adjustment to immortality. Ethan helped more than I could have imagined. His century of experience surviving as a vampire, combined with his recent healing under our care, made him uniquely qualified to understand what newly turned vampires needed. He helped me refine my approaches, pointed out gaps in my planning, shared insights I couldn't have gained on my own. We spread word carefully through vampire networks. Lucian used his connections, and he had many, built up over centuries to let other vampires know that help was available for their newly turned progeny. We created a quiet reputation, a place where struggling vampires could go without judgment, without fear of execution for their instability. Our first client arrived 2 weeks into the trial period. Her name was Maya, and she was a mess. She had been turned 2 weeks earlier by a vampire who had disappeared immediately after abandoned her without explanation or guidance. She didn't understand what had happened to her, didn't know how to control her new strength, didn't know how to feed without killing. She had been trying to survive on animal blood, which left her weak and malnourished. She was on the verge of a complete psychological breakdown. When she stumbled through our door, desperate and terrified, I saw myself from 2 months earlier. The same confusion, the same fear, the same desperate need for someone to explain what was happening. The only difference was that I had had Lucian to guide me. Maya had no one. I spent 3 intensive days with Maya. We started with the basics, teaching her to control her strength through repeated exercises, showing her how to modulate her speed, helping her understand and filter her enhanced senses. We set up a feeding protocol using ethically sourced blood, explaining the biology of vampire nutrition, demonstrating proper technique. But the physical training was only part of it. Maya also needed emotional support, psychological counseling, help processing the trauma of her transformation. I drew on techniques I had learned in medical school: active listening, validation, cognitive behavioral approaches adapted for vampire-specific issues. We talked about her human life and what she had lost. We talked about her grief and anger and fear. We talked about her new existence and how to find meaning in immortality. We talked about practical matters: how to maintain the masquerade, how to fake human behaviors, how to exist in a world that didn't know vampires were real. By the end of those 3 days, Maya was transformed not in her vampiric nature, but in her understanding and acceptance of it. She left our center stable, confident, ready to build a life for herself. She had the tools she needed to survive and thrive, and watching her walk out that door with her head high was one of the most rewarding moments of my new life. And she spread the word. Within 2 weeks, we had 5 more clients. Within a month, 10. Each had their own story of trauma and confusion, their own struggles with transformation, their own desperate need for help. I worked with a vampire named Marcus who had been turned in a violent attack and couldn't control his rage. I helped a young woman named Lee who had been turned to prevent her death from cancer but couldn't accept her new existence. I counseled a former priest named Thomas who believed his vampirism had damned his soul and was contemplating suicide by sunlight. Each case was different. Each required a unique approach. But all of them benefited from systematic support, from having someone who understood what they were going through, from knowing they weren't alone in their struggle. Ethan flourished in his role as peer counselor. Watching him work with other newly turned vampires was beautiful. He had spent so long feeling like a freak, an aberration, alone in his eternal childhood. Now he could help others, could use his century of survival experience to guide those who were just beginning their journeys. He was particularly effective with child vampires, a rare category, thankfully, but a devastating one. Being turned young meant centuries of existing in a body that would never grow, never mature, never be taken seriously. Ethan understood that unique hell, and his support helped several young vampires find acceptance and hope. Lucien watched it all with quiet pride. I would catch him sometimes, observing our work from the shadows, and see something in his expression that looked almost like peace. He had gambled everything on saving me, had risked his own immortality on a stranger. Now he was seeing that gamble pay off in ways he probably hadn't imagined. But more than that, I think he was rediscovering purpose after centuries of drift. He had been existing without really living for so long, watching the world change without participating. Now he was part of something meaningful, something that was actively making vampire society better. As the 3-month deadline approached, I compiled comprehensive documentation of our work. 37 newly turned vampires had come through our doors, 37 lives stabilized, 37 potential disasters prevented. I wrote detailed case studies demonstrating our methods and their effectiveness. I tracked outcomes showing that our clients were integrating successfully into vampire society. I created statistical analyses showing the measurable impact of systematic support on transformation success rates. I collected testimonials from grateful clients and their makers. I built a compelling case that our work wasn't just helpful, it was essential for the health and stability of vampire society. But even as I prepared for my return to the council, I realized something unexpected. I didn't want to stop. This work had given me purpose, had made my transformation mean something. Whether or not the council accepted me, I knew I would continue helping newly turned vampires for as long as I existed. This was what I was meant to do. This was why Lucien had saved me. This was my contribution to vampire society, my way of turning tragedy into triumph, my purpose for the centuries ahead. The final judgment. The second appearance before the council was different from the first in every way. This time, I walked into that underground chamber with my head high, carrying thick binders full of documentation, letters from grateful clients, statistical analyses proving our success. This time, I wasn't begging for my life. I was presenting proof that my life had value. Lucien walked beside me as a partner rather than a protector. We had built something together, something that mattered. We were ready to defend it. The council members sat in their same positions, but the atmosphere felt different. Less hostile, more curious. They had given me a chance, and now they wanted to see what I had done with it. Morgana invited me to present my findings. I did so methodically, professionally, drawing on every presentation skill I had learned in medical school. I showed them statistics about vampire survival rates before and after our intervention, a demonstrable improvement that couldn't be argued with. I presented testimonials from clients who are now thriving members of vampire society. I outlined a plan for expanding the program, for creating a network of transition centers across major cities, for training other vampires in our methods. I made it clear that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about creating a resource that the entire vampire community needed and would continue to benefit from long after the question of my existence was resolved. When I finished, Alessandra was the first to speak. She acknowledged that the high mortality rate among newly turned vampires had been a concern for decades, but no one had addressed it systematically until now. She said my approach was innovative and effective, that combining human medical knowledge with vampire experience was something they should have thought of themselves. Her endorsement was significant. She was the healer among the council, the one most likely to understand and appreciate my work. If she supported me, others might follow. Victor questioned me about security and sustainability. How would we maintain the masquerade as the program grew? How would we fund expansion without drawing human attention? How would we prevent the centers from becoming targets? I answered each question with detailed plans and protocols. I had anticipated these concerns and prepared comprehensive responses. Victor nodded slowly, apparently satisfied. Isabella asked about precedent again, but this time from a different angle. She wanted to know what message successful expansion would send to vampire society. Would it encourage more unauthorized transformations? Would it change vampire culture in unexpected ways? I acknowledged that any significant program would have ripple effects, but argued that those effects would be positive, that reducing transformation mortality would make vampire society stronger and more stable, that newly turned vampires who received proper support would be better citizens and community members. Chen asked about my long-term vision. Where did I see this work in 100 years? In 1,000? It was a question that acknowledged my immortality, that treated me as if I would survive this judgment and continue existing indefinitely. That subtle assumption gave me hope. I told him I envisioned a comprehensive vampire healthcare system, addressing not just transformation, but ongoing mental health, trauma recovery, quality of life issues. That vampires deserved more than mere survival, they deserved to thrive, to find happiness and meaning in their immortality. Chen smiled slightly, the first expression I had seen on his ancient face. It was encouraging. Finally, Morgana stood. The chamber fell silent. This was the moment that would determine whether I lived or died, whether Lucian's sacrifice had been worthwhile, whether the past 3 months of intense work would be recognized or dismissed. She acknowledged that my work had exceeded their expectations, that the transition center had proven its value beyond doubt, that vampire society would be stronger with me in it than without me, that Lucien's risk, while technically illegal, had produced results that benefited everyone. Then she spoke the words I had been desperately hoping to hear. My transformation was sanctioned retroactively. My existence was officially recognized as legitimate. Lucian would face no punishment for turning me. The Transition Center would receive official council support and funding to expand its operations. I felt tears of blood gathering in my eyes. Lucian's hand found mine and squeezed. We had done it. Against impossible odds, despite breaking fundamental vampire law, we had built something so valuable that the council was willing to not just forgive, but actively support it. But Morgana wasn't finished. She said my work had impressed the council enough that they had an additional proposal. They wanted me to serve as the official transition advisor to the council, to establish centers in every major city, to train other vampires in my methods, to create a comprehensive system for helping newly turned vampires across the entire vampire world. They were offering me not just acceptance, but authority, recognition, a formal place in vampire society that went far beyond simply being allowed to exist. I accepted without hesitation, bowing deeply in gratitude. As we left the council chamber for the second time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: complete peace. My transformation, traumatic as it had been, had led to something good. My loss had created opportunity. My death had given birth to a purpose that would last for centuries. Epilogue. Eternal purpose. 3 years have passed since that October night when a drunk driver killed me and Lucian Drax offered me an impossible choice. 3 years that have been the most meaningful of both my lives, human and vampire combined. The Transition Center has expanded far beyond anything I imagined during those frantic first 3 months. We now have facilities in 23 cities across 4 continents. I've trained over 50 vampire counselors, spreading the knowledge and techniques that have proven so effective. We've helped over 300 newly turned vampires find their way in this dark new world, and our success rate is over 95%. But the work has evolved beyond just survival. We now offer ongoing support, mental health services, community building. We run support groups for vampires struggling with various challenges, those dealing with transformation trauma, those who turned child vampires and struggle with eternal youth, those who miss their humanity, those who are lonely in their immortality. We've created a network where vampires can find connection, understanding, support. My relationship with Lucian has deepened into something beautiful and complex. What started as maker and fledgling, savior and saved, has evolved into genuine partnership and love. We work together, building the program we both believe in. We live together, sharing space and existence in ways that feel natural despite how strange our relationship would seem to outsiders. We face eternity together, two souls finding solace in each other. He has shown me centuries of vampire history, shared his accumulated wisdom, taught me what it means to exist outside human time. I have shown him renewed purpose, given him connection he had been missing, reminded him that even ancient vampires can still grow and change and find meaning. Ethan has become my little brother in every way that matters. He's now a lead counselor at the Transition Center, specializing in helping child vampires and newly turned young adults. He's found confidence and purpose that I think he never had in his century alone. He still looks 12, but he carries himself like someone far older, with wisdom earned through survival and healing. The three of us, Lucian, Ethan, and I, have built a real family, not bound by blood or biology, but by choice and shared experience and mutual love. We are three beings who were damaged by transformation, but found healing together. Three predators who retained enough humanity to build something good. I still think about my human life sometimes, about my parents, who I watched from afar as they slowly healed from their grief, though the scar never fully faded. About Sarah, who got married, had 2 children, built the life I would have wanted for her. About the traditional medical career I never had, the patients I never helped in the expected way. That loss will always hurt. The grief never entirely fades. But I've learned to carry it alongside the purpose I've found in my vampire existence. I've learned that transformation, even traumatic, non-consensual transformation, doesn't have to be the end. It can be a beginning. I'm still a doctor. I still heal, still help, still save lives. The patients are different now, and the diseases are existential rather than physical, but the core mission remains the same: reduce suffering, promote healing, give people hope for their futures. The hunger is still there, it will always be there. But I've learned to manage it, to feed ethically, to be a vampire without being a monster. It's a balance I'll maintain forever, one blood bag at a time, one controlled feeding at a time, one choice to value life rather than just consume it. Immortality is strange. Some nights I still can't quite believe it's real, that I'll exist for centuries or maybe millennia, that everyone I care about who isn't a vampire will eventually die while I remain. The weight of that knowledge can be crushing, but I've also learned that immortality doesn't have to be a curse. Yes, I'll watch mortals I care about age and die. Yes, the world will change in ways I can't predict. Yes, there will be loneliness and loss and grief that accumulates over endless years. But I'll also see wonders. I'll witness human progress, technological miracles, cultural evolution. I'll form connections with other immortals who understand these unique challenges. I'll have time, endless time to learn, to grow, to explore, to help. Most importantly, I'll have purpose. Every newly turned vampire I help, every lost soul I guide toward acceptance and peace, every life I save from the despair that can consume new vampires, that's meaning that will last for centuries. That's a legacy worth building across eternity. My name is Clara Valen. I died on a Tuesday night in October, killed by a drunk driver who didn't care about the life he destroyed. But I also was reborn that same night, given a second chance at existence by a lonely vampire who saw something worth saving. I lost my humanity, my family, my friends, my planned future. I lost everything I thought I was and everything I thought I would become. But I gained something too. I gained Lucian, who risked everything to save me and found salvation himself in the process. I gained Ethan, my eternal little brother who proves that even century-old trauma can heal with love and support. I gained purpose that will span centuries, work that matters, the ability to help others through the darkness I survived. I was given eternal night, and in that darkness, I found family, purpose, and a life worth living forever. Some people say that vampires are cursed, that immortality is a burden, that we're monsters who prey on humanity. Maybe they're right. Maybe we are cursed, burdened, monstrous, but we're also capable of compassion, healing, love. We can choose to be more than just predators. We can find meaning in the endless years. We can build something good in the shadows. And that choice, the choice to be better than what we are, to use our curse for good, to find light in the darkness, that's what makes existence worthwhile. Forever is a long time. But with people to love and work that matters, it doesn't seem nearly long enough.